It felt like the floor was moving, and it was odd.
I said, you're making this up. You got to snap out of it.
She didn't know it was wrong, and it was just a really big mystery.
Everyone who approached me came in gowned and masked, and I kept asking, do you know what's wrong with me?
Next, 2 medical mysteries that defy the experts. At first, Rosanne Jensen thinks she's just suffering from a simple case of jet lag, until her entire world begins to literally spin out of control.
I totally thought she was crazy.
They had no idea what was wrong with me. It was pure living hell.
Then, Janet Long has been enduring debilitating bouts of diarrhea for more than 3 decades. And just when she thinks it can't get any worse, a series of terrifying new symptoms begins to emerge.
This was something new for us and very, very scary for both of us.
I really felt that there was a possibility that I would die.
When illness strikes, we look to doctors to give us answers. But what if they can't? For these unlucky patients, diagnosis is a mystery. In the summer of 1993, Knoxville, Tennessee native Rosanne Jensen was leading the life she'd always dreamed of. In fact, between her doting husband and 2 adorable kids, she'd never been happier or felt better.
I was a health nut. I like to eat healthy, and I like to work out, and I like to just keep my body in really good shape.
Rosanne loved being outdoors all the time, doing stuff. She had a nice body on her.
But little does Rosanne realize that her seemingly perfect life is about to spiral out of control.
My husband was going to be going on a trip to California for about a month, and we decided to go with him.
So we all just packed up and got on an airplane and flew to California.
The plane ride was pretty much normal with 2 little kids. Got off the plane in San Francisco.
As soon as they land, the family starts driving down the coast on their way to Los Angeles. But when they stop at a restaurant for lunch, Rosanne begins to feel something she's never felt before.
When we stopped at a restaurant and we were standing on tile floor, a very solid restaurant, it felt like the floor was moving. And I, inside, felt like, was an earthquake going on or something, because I'm in California.
Wondering if jet lag is playing tricks on her, she takes a few deep breaths and just tries to gather herself. But no matter what she does, the bizarre feeling doesn't let up.
She turned around and looked at me and she said, "Do you feel a little weird?" I said, "No, I don't."
It was so much stronger in the restaurant at that point that it was a bit alarming.
Eventually, the weird rocking sensation subsides. But over the next 2 weeks, Rosanne struggles to enjoy the family's vacation as she begins to experience the relentless attacks on a daily basis.
Where I had felt it most was if I was sitting solid or sitting on the bed in the hotel room. Just sitting there, I would feel like I'm rocking, like I'm on a boat, like I was literally actually in the water in waves. And it was odd.
At the time, I didn't think there was anything wrong with Rosanne, so I just told her, just, take it easy and take a nap, and I will take care of the kids.
Rosanne is hoping that once they return home, the freakish feeling will vanish as quickly as it appeared. But as soon as she walks into the house, she experiences yet another attack.
I remember looking at the curtain, and the curtain looked like it was moving a little bit. And that was always questionable, like, am I moving or is the curtain moving?
The strange sensation scares her, and as the weeks go by, the intermittent spells begin to take their toll.
I did feel more worn out and stressed. I guess you'd say fatigued. There were days that I had to just sit basically on the floor and just try to get my balance back.
Making things even worse, Chris is having a hard time believing anything is wrong with her at all.
The way I'm brought up is, unless you see blood coming out of you or a bone sticking out of you, you're okay. So no, I didn't take it seriously at all.
But Rosanne is convinced that it's not all in her head.
And so that's when I decided that I wanted to just ask my family doctor if he had any idea what was going on. I was hoping it was an ear infection or a sinus infection because that's pretty easy to clear up.
Rosanne gives the doctor a detailed account of her mysterious symptom, and then he performs a comprehensive physical exam.
And he told me, "You appear completely healthy in every other way. Everything tests out fine. We could do further checkup. I don't really think you need it."
Rosanne can't believe what she's hearing.
So I insisted. I said, this has happened too many times. I want to find out what's going on.
The doctor tells Rosanne the only other thing he can do is perform an MRI, since balance disorders can sometimes be linked to abnormalities in the brain.
I had never had an MRI before. It just was a little intimidating to go inside this big tube. When we went there, actually, I had them let my husband come in the room with me and hold my foot because it was scary.
Everything would be fine, but everything would be wrong. And, of course, we didn't know what to expect at the time.
All Rosanne and Chris can do now is wait for the results. It's the most agonizing week of their lives.
I was scared. I was very scared. I was afraid that possibly there was a brain tumor and that what would my kids do without me?
But nothing could have prepared Rosanne for what the images would reveal.
And they said, "You're totally clear. There's nothing wrong. Nothing wrong with you." So I was happy that there was nothing wrong, but then it still had the question, what's going on? What is this? Because the doctors had no clue, and they had never heard of this rocking kind of dizziness.
Rosanne leaves the doctor's office, confused and frustrated.
Everyone used to tell me that I looked normal, I acted normal, I walked normal, so it didn't look like anything was wrong with me.
I totally thought she was crazy. After the doctor said he couldn't find anything wrong, then I said, you're making this up. You got to snap out of it.
Rosanne Jensen has been consumed by a wave of bizarre spells that leave her feeling like her whole world is rocking, literally, and no doctor seems to have any idea what's causing it.
The symptoms came and went, and I'd go to take a shower in the morning. I'd bend over to wash my hair, close my eyes, and I felt like I could fall over.
Rosanne manages to live with the episodes for a few years, but eventually they begin to wear her down, especially when she realizes that they're starting to worry her children and alienate her husband.
She'd always get these attacks or dizziness, and she would just watch us play, and it was sad because she couldn't participate in anything.
When I was about 5 years old, I remember going up to my mom's room, and the door was locked. And I wanted to talk to her, so I kept banging on the door and asking, "Mom, are you there?" And I didn't know it was wrong, and she didn't know it was wrong. And it was just a really big mystery.
She drove me nuts a lot of times because I couldn't understand it, It was bad. It was really bad.
Determined once again to prove that it's not all in her head, Rosanne makes another appointment with a new doctor. From the get-go, she knows it will be a struggle.
I try to make visuals for them. I try to take my hands and say, it feels like I'm being pushed and pulled. It feels like I'm on a rocky dock, ready to fall off of it. It just feels like the earth is moving underneath me.
Baffled by Rosanne's description of her symptoms, the doctor decides to test her for one of the most common balance disorders, vertigo.
They put water in your ears, hot and cold water, which provokes true vertigo, which was very frightening.
By placing fluids of varying temperatures in the ear canal, the doctor stimulates Rosanne's inner ear in an attempt to throw off her sense of balance. Then he asks her to follow a series of small moving lights on the wall, hoping to detect involuntary eye movements that only occur when a person is suffering from vertigo. An hour later, the findings are in.
The result of the test was that I was normal. And since I checked out healthy in every other way, they just sort of said, well, live with it. You're doing okay. But I wasn't doing okay inside.
Still bent on finding an explanation, Rosanne schedules exams with 3 more experts. But none of them find anything out of the ordinary.
I questioned the doctors. I don't think the doctors were happy that I was questioning them. It was just so frustrating.
Worst of all, the condition is continuing to pull her further and further away from her family.
I was very confused about what was going on. She didn't look unhealthy, but I could tell that something was very wrong.
She's my mom and I love her. So I tried to help her, but at times I didn't think I could, so I sort of just stayed off to the sides.
I felt helpless, and that's what really started hurting me, is that I couldn't do anything for her.
Chris soon finds himself doing all he can to escape the intolerable situation at home.
I think it drew us apart because I couldn't understand it, and we used to get arguments about it. It's one of the major reasons we got separated.
I believe that the illness was part of a factor in Chris and my divorce, the frustration that he had to go through and that I went through, and just trying to get through this and find an answer.
Feeling more isolated than ever, Rosanne stops talking about her symptoms entirely, preferring to suffer alone in silence.
I just started keeping quiet about it because it was almost embarrassing, like I had a defect or something, and tired of people thinking I was making it up. It was pure living hell.
Little does Rosanne know that her worst nightmare is far from over. In fact, it's just beginning.
One day when I was working in a salon, I was working on somebody's hair, and all of a sudden it felt like the floor dropped out from underneath me. I went into like a cold sweat, and I basically had a panic attack. I had to hold on to the counter. I didn't know what to do. I just sat down for a while and I just tried to breathe, and it scared me to death. Like, what is happening to me? It was stronger than anything I had ever felt to that point. I told my boss that I think I need to leave for the day.
Rosanne staggers out to the parking lot and into her car. Surprisingly, it's the one place she feels comfortable.
One of the weird things was when I was in a car, I would feel normal in the car. As soon as I got out of the car, I felt like I was back on the boat, back rocking, back not on the earth anymore. And I felt like that was so strange. I got in my car carefully, drove myself home, and basically sat on the couch and cried and got scared.
It's a turning point for Rosanne. Fed up with the experts who don't take her seriously, she soon launches her own one-woman investigation.
After I had had that attack at this salon, I gathered books together from the library. I bought books. I started searching on the internet daily. I was obsessed with finding an answer for this problem.
And then one night, Rosanne stumbles onto something.
I just was searching, and I was looking, and I found all the symptoms that I was having almost exactly to a T, everything that I was feeling. And I felt like, oh my gosh, I found an answer.
She prints out everything she's found and hightails it to her current doctor, hoping that he'll be able to confirm her hunch.
And he said, I need to send you to the guy with the big guns, the guy in Nashville. And that's when I was referred to Dr. Schwaber.
I received a letter from Rosanne. Most of the symptoms that she described were a rocking motion, a wave-like motion going up and down, much like you would feel had you been on a boat or a ride, such as at a fair or an amusement park. After reading the letter, I was fairly certain that I knew what the problem was.
Rosanne Jensen has been living with a bizarre and debilitating rocking sensation for more than 6 years. Now she's on her way to Nashville to see balance disorder specialist Dr. Mitchell Schwaber, and she's praying that he'll have the answer she's been so desperately looking for.
She was very, very frustrated because no one seemed to be able to establish what it was that was wrong with her, and she knew that she felt a balance disturbance, but no one could identify it.
After giving her a thorough head-to-toe neurological exam, Dr. Schwaber thinks he knows what might be plaguing Rosanne. But in order to confirm his suspicion, he must run a highly specialized test.
I recommended that she have a computerized dynamic posturography. It's a test where a patient is asked to stand on a platform.
Yeah, I remember the platform test that he did with me. It was really strange.
As Rosanne steps onto the machine, the platform starts to shift in varying degrees beneath her feet.
I was in this harness, and these pictures in front of me, it looked like almost like a landscape was moving in front of me, and I had to focus on different points that they told me to do.
We asked the patient to do it with their eyes open, their eyes closed, and when the visual field is moving. By doing all of this, we can determine how the vestibular system or the inner ear is working and whether it's sensitive to gravity or not.
It was hard to keep your balance on this machine. Pretty hard.
She was in the shoulder harness, and when the floor actually shifted, she actually had a fall, or would have fallen if the harness hadn't have caught her. So it indicated that she was not able to maintain her balance, even with slight changes in gravity level.
The moment Rosanne loses her balance, Dr. Schwaber realizes that he's found the crucial piece of the puzzle.
At that time, based on the symptoms that she had, the prior studies being normal, and the platform study showing the gravity center being abnormal, we really felt very strongly that she had the disembarking syndrome.
Disembarkment syndrome, or mal de débarquement, is thought to be triggered by an abnormality in the gravity receptors of the inner ear. The gravity receptors help maintain a person's balance by sending a signal to the brain when the body experiences movement, like during a boat ride. When the movement stops, the receptors help the body adjust to being back on solid ground. But in patients like Rosanne, the gravity receptors, for unknown reasons, fail to readjust to stable ground, leaving her with a sensation of being in constant motion.
In Ms. Jensen's case, the problem continued on and on and on.
Dr. Schwaber believes Rosanne's condition may have been triggered by her seemingly routine plane trip to San Francisco so many years ago.
And I do remember feeling the feeling after getting off the plane a little bit stronger.
It's all starting to make sense to Rosanne. But if the plane trip triggered the initial symptoms, why did the rocking sensation begin to wane every time she got into her car?
Of particular interest is that she is able to make the symptoms go away when she drives, which indicates that when the gravity center is being continuously stimulated, it makes the symptom go away. It's when she's seated or on land or walking around that the rocking sensation comes back.
For the first time in almost 7 years, Rosanne feels validated.
It felt very relieving to feel like a doctor for once knows what it is, has knowledge of this, and possibly knows something that I can do about it.
But the diagnosis is bittersweet.
Unfortunately, there is no cure for the disembarking syndrome. It can last for many, many years with continuous rocking motion going on for 10 or 15 years. It can also go away spontaneously. There's a lot of research being done to try and come up with medications and even surgeries to correct the abnormality, so that we're hopeful that in the future we can fix the problem, correct the abnormality, and make the patients feel better.
It's saddening to know that there's no cure for it, but having the diagnosis made me feel like at least there's a name for it. It is real.
If I could take that, all the information she has today, and brought it back 10 years ago, it would totally change our lifestyles, our marriage, our relationship, and everything else.
Understandably, when a person has been misdiagnosed or unable to be diagnosed for quite some time, they begin to think that they have a mental problem.
In fact, many patients with undiagnosed balance disorders frequently suffer from severe panic attacks.
One of the things that we now know is that a lot of vestibular disorders trigger anxiety, and a lot of anxiety can trigger a vestibular disorder. There's a lot of overlap.
Rosanne considers herself lucky to have been diagnosed at all. But she can't help but wonder why so many doctors fail to put the seemingly simple pieces of the puzzle together.
Well, this is a very, very rare syndrome. In my practice, we see no more than 1 or 2 of these patients every 2 or 3 years, and most physicians are either not aware of it or have not heard of it.
Today, Rosanne still suffers from the symptoms of disembarkment syndrome, but she refuses to let her condition slow her down. She continues to research possible treatments and cures, but most importantly, she's come to learn just how resilient she can be.
I've learned that you've got to pretty much take hold of your own health issues. If there's something wrong with you that you can't find an answer to, or the doctors can't find an answer to, you have to just keep pushing and searching and looking, and don't give up on it. I will continue to keep looking for treatment until we find an answer. I'll keep on trying. Won't give up.
While Rosanne Jensen spent 6 years trying to convince everyone that her strange medical condition wasn't just in her head, Janet Long suffered through more than 3 decades of debilitating attacks that were undeniably real. In 1970, Janet Long was a carefree 11-year-old, living a seemingly idyllic childhood on the plains of Nebraska.
I grew up in the Midwest and had a pretty happy childhood, and I played a lot outside with my friends.
But when young Janet gets her first period in the fall of that year, she is completely unprepared for her body's dramatic reaction.
I would have excruciating stomach pain, and I wouldn't be able to go to school for a day or 2.
Her mother assures her that the agonizing cramps are just a part of growing up.
Back in those days, there wasn't much she could do for me except give me a couple baby aspirin and a hot water bottle.
But when Janet enters high school, new and very embarrassing symptoms begin to emerge.
At that point, I would also have occasional times of diarrhea and vomiting. I figured I was just a girl who was having a really tough time every month, and that was probably what every girl went through.
Over the years, Janet learns to endure the severe monthly episodes and manages to make it through high school without anyone catching on. But during her first semester at college, the crippling attacks begin to intensify, and she can no longer keep the disturbing symptoms to herself.
And I can remember calling my parents and saying, this just is much harder than what I've ever had before.
At her parents' urging, she schedules an appointment with a university doctor. He performs a thorough head-to-toe exam, but when he can't find anything wrong, the doctor concludes that the attacks must have simply been triggered by a bad case of college stress.
I think my mother and I both came to the conclusion that I was indeed just having stomach trouble from tension. So we just thought that that was just something I was going to have to deal with, and pretty much that's what I did.
Each day is a challenge for Janet as she scopes out the closest bathrooms and struggles to hide the humiliating episodes.
I continued to have severe stomach pain, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea.
But one night, it becomes impossible for Janet to hide the painful attacks any longer.
At one point, I went out to eat with my friends, came home and didn't feel well, and thought, well, it must be something I ate. And in about 3 hours, I would guess, from that time, I was literally crawling on the floor.
Writhing in pain, Janet spends hours locked in the bathroom. She's never experienced an attack this intense.
By that night, I was having severe diarrhea and realized that there was blood in the toilet.
In a state of panic, Janet realizes that she has to get help fast. She calls for her roommate, who rushes her to the nearest emergency room.
By that time, I had lost a lot of blood and was quite weak.
After listening to Janet describe the sudden violent attack, the ER doctors fear that she may have contracted a highly contagious intestinal virus. They immediately order Janet into quarantine to prevent her from infecting anyone else.
It was very scary for me. Everyone who approached me came in gowned and masked, and I kept asking, do you know what's wrong with me? And no one was really answering my questions.
The problem is that the experts are just as confused as she is. They quickly rule out an infection, then begin running a slew of tests in an attempt to figure out what could be causing her to bleed internally.
I had colonoscopies, all kinds of ultrasounds, all kinds of x-rays, barium exams, dye exams, and each one of those was really excruciatingly painful.
Finally, 3 days later, the doctors have a theory. It appears that Janet may be suffering from a rare condition called Meckel's diverticulum. Essentially, it is a bulge the size of an adult thumb on the interior wall of the small intestine. This abnormal growth must be removed before it blocks her intestine and causes potentially fatal bleeding. The only course of action is immediate surgery.
I was very unnerved, I think, mostly because of the bleeding. I had never had bleeding before, and that was frightening to me. I really felt that there was a possibility that I would die.
After enduring a violent attack of diarrhea and vomiting, Janet Long has been admitted to the hospital. She's bleeding internally and is on her way into surgery to remove what doctors believe is a blockage in her small intestine.
I was by myself, and it just felt like things were not going to come to a good end.
But after 4 intense hours in the OR, the doctors are shocked by what they find. There is no evidence of any blockage or bleeding in Janet's abdomen whatsoever. Baffled, they immediately call off the surgery.
After I came out of the surgery, they told me that they couldn't find anything in my abdomen that was unusual.
While she's relieved that the bleeding has stopped, Janet is having a hard time understanding why no doctor can explain what's going on.
I asked, what are the chances this is going to happen again? And I was told, well, we really don't know. We really can't tell you.
Dumbfounded by the disturbing turn of events, Janet is discharged, and within 2 weeks, the brutal symptoms return with a vengeance.
And I was planning on it eventually just completely clearing up, but that didn't happen.
But Janet is determined to take back control of her life and does her best to ride out the painful episodes whenever they strike. Then, when she least expects it, she meets Matthew Long.
Jen and I hit it off from the start. I have always enjoyed her company. She's a pleasure to be with.
Still horrified by the embarrassing attacks, Janet works hard to conceal her condition from Matthew.
I really felt that it was my struggle and it was mine to get through.
I had no idea how serious her symptoms were, none at all.
But when Matthew proposes in 1986, Janet knows that she has to reveal her dark secret to the man she's going to marry.
When she first told me about her sickness, she told me that it was chronic, it wasn't going away.
And he was very sweet and said, that's all right. I want to marry you, and in sickness and in health. So we were married that October.
Over the course of the next 2 years, the unpredictable attacks continue to torment her. But every doctor she checks in with insists that there's nothing clinically wrong with her. Then, in 1988, the Longs get a surprise when they discover that Janet is pregnant. It's an exhilarating moment for the young couple, but they also worry about her ability to cope with the rigors of a 9-month pregnancy.
I remember when Jan told me she was pregnant. I remember quite clearly the excitement of it all and the apprehension of it all at the same time.
But the couple is shocked when the first trimester turns out to be far easier than either of them ever expected.
I remember saying to my husband, boy, I haven't felt this good in a long time. If this is what pregnancy does to you, I want to be pregnant all the time. So I thought, well, maybe pregnancy has cured me.
But 9 months later, right after their daughter Anna is born, the harrowing attacks return almost overnight.
I can remember there were times when I would have her in my arms and be trying to take care of her or even nurse her while I was sitting on the toilet. I had no choice.
Distraught, Janet finds herself back to square one, searching for answers.
Jan went to a number of doctors, and that was extremely frustrating for her.
I couldn't understand why I'd seen so many doctors, and yet there wasn't anyone who could come up with something that, if it wasn't a diagnosis, at least with some kind of treatment that would make me feel better.
As painful as the attacks are, the doctors don't believe they pose a major health threat. So Janet just continues to grin and bear it. Then she finds out that she's pregnant again.
I was excited, thinking, wow, this is great. And pregnancy cures it all. It's going to be fabulous. And probably about halfway through that pregnancy, I just got really sick and went right back to the nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. I went back again to the gastroenterologist, but they really couldn't give me an answer. And eventually, you know, after so many times of going to see a doctor and they can't tell you what's wrong with you, you tend to give up going to the doctor.
But the real struggle is yet to come. When her second daughter, Jenna, is born, Janet is suddenly faced with the prospect of taking care of a newborn and a toddler all at once. It is worse than she could have ever imagined.
She'd disappear into the bathroom, be there for extended periods of time.
But as difficult as it is for Matthew to watch, he can't convince Janet to go back to the doctor.
There were a few times when I would ask her if it's time to go to the emergency room, and she was very reluctant to do so.
And when she gets pregnant a third time, Janet begins to worry that the incessant attacks could be threatening the life of her baby.
My most vivid memory is being pregnant and just vomiting, just hours and hours. And I thought something was wrong with the baby.
Scared stiff, Matthew rushes Janet to the closest emergency room.
I just was curled up in the back seat trying to get there, and I just felt that it was the end.
After suffering through more than 6 hours of violent diarrhea and vomiting, Janet Long's husband is rushing her to the closest emergency room. She's in the 3rd trimester of her pregnancy.
My biggest concern was that the baby was all right.
As a first step, the ER doctor performs an ultrasound to see what's going on. Immediately, it's clear that there's a strange and alarming fluid surrounding her womb.
And I said, well, what would cause that? And he said, well, I really can't tell you. I have no idea.
Suddenly, the young parents are terrified that they could lose their child.
During that time in the emergency room with Jan, I was very scared. This was something new for us and very, very scary for both of us.
But as soon as their doctor arrives and reviews Janet's charts, she gives them the news they've been so desperate to hear.
And she came in and said, the baby's fine. I was very happy that the baby was all right. That was my biggest concern. But I really wondered, why was there fluid all through my abdomen? And I was surprised that no one could tell me.
But while the experts are trying to figure out exactly what's going on, the strange fluid vanishes almost as quickly as it appeared.
And the doctors said, well, it looks like you're getting better. Why don't you go home?
Outraged by the doctor's dismissal, Janet finally decides to take matters into her own hands.
I can remember thinking I have to find a specialist if I'm going to get an answer.
In less than 24 hours, Janet manages to track down Dr. Jacqueline Wolfe, a highly respected gastroenterologist in Boston.
When Janet came to see me, she was very scared. She had fluid in her abdomen, and we don't usually see that in pregnancy unless something else is going on. I examined from her head down to the bottom of her neck, which was totally normal. Then I looked carefully at her abdomen because this is the place that she was having her complaints. And I examined her to make sure she didn't have tenderness, and everything in her belly was normal. Her symptoms and her history was very unusual.
In fact, Dr. Wolfe has never seen anything like Janet's case before.
I thought Janet had something, but I didn't know what it was.
Completely discouraged, Janet heads home, wondering if anyone will ever be able to crack her case.
I had very little confidence that anyone was ever going to figure out what was wrong with me.
2 months after the alarming episode, Matthew and Janet's 3rd daughter, Kaisa, is born healthy, but Janet is feeling worse than ever.
After Kaisa was born, the frequency of the attacks continued to increase, and Jan would spend more time in the bathroom.
It's a difficult time for Janet as she struggles to manage 3 children alongside seemingly endless trips to the bathroom. Then, when she least expects it, a strange new symptom emerges.
My hands would get red and itchy, and then they would start to swell. If I got down on my hands and knees to wash the floor, the motion of pushing on the floor with the sponge would make my hand swell, and the swelling would go from my hand into my arm and from my arm up into my shoulder.
Disturbed by the mysterious swelling, Matthew insists that Janet check in with a family physician.
We went to the doctor and I explained to them, and they said, oh, it's probably allergic. You'll just have to watch what you use for soap, and sent me back home.
Janet tries experimenting with various detergents and other cleaning products, but the swelling seems to take on a life of its own.
They got worse. The patches, the blotches, the swelling got worse.
On her last leg, Janet begins spending more and more time isolated in the house with the children.
At times when we were really young, my mom would be in the bathroom trying to keep herself together. Me and my younger sister, we would be playing around while my mom had bigger things on her mind.
It was just when she was sick, she was very sick.
A lot of times I would lay on the couch beside them and just watch them play so that I could at least know they were safe and be near them.
For the sake of her daughters, Janet decides her only choice is to fight back.
I wanted to live for my 3 girls. I wanted to get better, and I think that was finally enough to get me to try one more time.
She starts by calling the only doctor who has ever seemed interested in solving her case, Dr. Jacqueline Wolf.
Janet came back again with the same symptoms, and we went through the same thing again. The abdominal pain, the vomiting, the burning in her belly. And I was just trying to find something else.
And as she went to walk out the door, she turned back around and she said, is there anything else, anything at all that you haven't told me that maybe I should know? And I said, well, there's these weird swelling things that I have, but the doctor tells me that it's allergies.
So on hearing this, I'm thinking now, well, this is connected. This is connected to what Janet has.
And it was like a light bulb went off over her head, and she looked at me and she said, I think I know what you have.
After more than 30 years suffering from unpredictable and crippling attacks of diarrhea, vomiting, and bizarre swellings, Janet Long may be on the verge of discovering exactly what's causing her mysterious constellation of symptoms.
When Janet told me about the swelling, it was my eureka moment. The swelling symptoms suggested that it's not just a stomach problem anymore. It sounds like it's involving the immune system. And I now had a way to try to look for that.
And a seemingly simple blood test could be all it takes to put a name to Janet's long nightmare.
The blood tests were directed at a condition where you're missing a very special protein in your body called C1 esterase inhibitor that has profound effects on the immune system. And when you don't have that, you can get swelling everywhere. We decided she would get blood work done, and that would be the very key to making the diagnosis.
They took the blood, and I remember driving home and thinking, wow, I may really actually know now what's wrong with me.
A few weeks later, when the blood test results finally come in, Dr. Wolf confirms her suspicion.
I had really amazing results. We now had the diagnosis. It was angioedema.
Hereditary angioedema, or HAE, is characterized by a deficiency of C1 inhibitor.
In fact, the C1 esterase inhibitor was less than half the lower limits of normal.
Normal C1 inhibitor circulates in the blood and controls inflammation, the body's way of protecting itself from harmful bacteria and viruses. But in patients like Janet, the deficient C1 inhibitor activates inflammation even when there are no invading substances to fight off. Her body, in essence, attacks itself, triggering random bouts of edema or swelling.
Her bowel is swelling up, so she was having diarrhea also. She's getting pain, and she's vomiting, and then all of a sudden it goes away. The condition occurs in many ways in many different people, and it can be so fast that in some of these people it can actually cause trouble breathing, and some people have died from problems breathing because of the quickness of onset.
While doctors don't know exactly what triggers the disease, they do speculate that hormonal changes have an effect, which explains why Janet's attacks started when she got her first period.
All of her symptoms were explainable by this condition. Pregnancy, which changes your whole body, can sometimes be a trigger for this.
It is almost impossible to predict how HAE will affect a woman during pregnancy. While some women report a reprieve in the attacks, others describe an onslaught of painful episodes. This explains Janet's radically different experiences between her first and second 2 pregnancies.
It was an incredible experience for me because that explains all these different things that had happened. I could say, okay, that makes sense.
After living with the debilitating and seemingly unexplainable symptoms for more than 30 years, Janet is completely overwhelmed by what she's hearing.
It's hard to describe, but it was such a revelation to me.
When Jan got her diagnosis, it was a time of elation around the house. We were all really excited.
There is no cure for HAE, but as a long-term preventative treatment, Janet is immediately put on an anabolic steroid to help control the random attacks of inflammation.
I can remember sitting in the bathroom shortly after I started medication thinking, wow, this is what it feels like to be without pain. That was really life-changing for me.
Now that she finally has her life back, Janet can't help but wonder why it took more than 30 years to find a doctor who could give her a solid diagnosis.
Janet was the first angioedema patient I had come across. These are rare conditions that you read about in medical school, and most people don't think of sending off the blood tests that would make the diagnosis.
In fact, HAE is so rare that as few as 1 in 50,000 people may have it worldwide. While Janet is thrilled to finally have the answer she's been desperately looking for, Dr. Wolf informs her that the case isn't closed yet.
Angioedema is often a hereditary condition, and therefore it was important that Janet have her children tested for angioedema.
When it turned out that Jenna also inherited the disease, I was happy to think that at least she would have a mom who knew what was going on with her, and I could then help her.
Diagnosis was very important to my mom. It was very important to her to know what was wrong with me because then she could protect me from it in the future.
Today, Janet is an outspoken advocate for HAE research and has even testified before the FDA in support of better treatments.
Information is power, so I would tell people who are still struggling, still searching, to not give up. It took me hundreds of doctors and 40 years, but because I went to that one last visit and tried one more time, I was able to find an answer.